In June 1950, the Korean War broke out. 75,000 North Korean soldiers crossed the 38th parallel, sparking the first major military clash of the Cold War. The conflict was relatively short but incredibly bloody. Over 3 years, it claimed nearly 5 million lives. This was a massive confrontation pitting UN forces against a coalition of communist-aligned armies. But the main players behind the scenes were the United States and China. To this day, there's no clear winner. The war never officially ended. A key figure in this conflict, and for decades after, was a man named Larry Wu-Tai-Chin. Starting in 1952, he worked with the Americans as a translator for Chinese prisoners of war. But he had a very specific way of translating. He wasn't always accurate. Sometimes, he deliberately distorted information. Why? Because he had been recruited by Chinese intelligence. Larry passed lists of prisoners to Beijing prisoners who had agreed to cooperate with the Americans or South Koreans. Once Chinese authorities got these lists, they made sure those individuals were returned home, where they faced severe consequences. This strategy achieved two things: it eliminated people China considered disloyal, and it prevented potential collaborators from appearing abroad. When the active phase of the Korean War ended in 1953, the need for prisoner transfers vanished. You'd think Larry's career as a spy would be over. But instead, he was transferred to work in the CIA's analytical department. And of course, no one suspected he was still an asset for Beijing. From 1953 all the way to 1985, Larry Chin funneled a constant stream of information to China. He passed on everything he could get his hands on about U.S. military capabilities, the location of key facilities, and sensitive intelligence related to the Far East. For his services, he received about $180,000, a huge sum for that time. He was incredibly careful about hiding his wealth. For more than 30 years, U.S. counterintelligence couldn't pinpoint the source of their leaks. Everyone who knew Larry just thought he was a big fan of casinos. So if he bought expensive things or threw lavish parties, people assumed he just had a lucky streak. And when he bought real estate, he did it in small towns to avoid drawing any attention. He was finally caught by accident. In 1986, Larry ran into some issues with his tax returns. The case was reopened, and investigators started digging deeper. That's when they uncovered his connections to espionage. With nowhere left to hide, he agreed to cooperate in exchange for a lighter sentence, revealing everything he had shared with his Chinese contacts. At his trial, he admitted to passing on some of the most sensitive intelligence reports concerning the Far East and confirmed he'd been paid for it. Chinese officials, for their part, denied everything. But that wasn't the end of the story. The day before his sentencing, Larry was found dead in his cell with a garbage bag over his head. The official cause of death was suicide. And officially, he whispered about outside involvement, pointing fingers at China's Ministry of State Security. It's a fascinating, dark story. And it brings up some big questions. Why are Chinese intelligence services considered so different from others? How do they recruit agents and work with Chinese citizens abroad? And why is the topic of loyalty so sensitive? We'll explore the incredible story of Shi Peipu, who conducted one of the most bizarre intelligence operations of the 20th century. And we'll look at how Chinese agencies use modern digital technology to monitor their population today. If you find this interesting, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get into what makes Chinese intelligence so unique. The first thing to understand is its origins. In 1939, just before World War II, the Soviet Union set up a special intelligence school for its Chinese partners. It was organized using NKVD methods, the precursor to the KGB. The structure, the training, the entire approach, it was all based on the Soviet model. By the late 1940s, Chinese agencies began to develop their own style, but the KGB's methods remained their foundation. They essentially just changed the names. The main intelligence body was called Shuibu, and later, other bureaus appeared. but almost all of them had Soviet advisors helping to build the hierarchy, organize operations, and manage population surveillance. Most of the intelligence services the Kremlin helped create in other countries were very similar to the KGB itself. The Polish, Czechoslovakian, and Hungarian services all followed the same playbook, but there were two major exceptions: East Germany's Stasi and China's intelligence agencies. Over time, as China developed, its agents became more technologically advanced, more inventive, and far more influential than their early mentors. Chinese intelligence is different because its strategy is based on what is called the thousand grains of sand concept. Instead of relying on a few highly trained professional spies, which is expensive, they use a massive network of ordinary people. This includes business people, civilians, scientists, and students, all collecting small, fragmented pieces of information. Together, these tiny grains of sand form a complete picture. But let us jump back in time to 1964. This was when Chinese intelligence pulled off one of its most unusual operations, right at the French embassy in Beijing. The story revolves around a man named Bernard Boursiquot, a French citizen working as an accountant at the embassy. One evening, he met an opera singer named Shi Peipu. They started talking, and during their conversation, Shi Peipu confessed something startling: she was actually a woman. She explained that due to difficult circumstances, her family had raised her as a boy. Boursiquot was captivated by her story and quickly developed strong feelings for her. Their connection blossomed into a long-term relationship that would span nearly 2 decades and change both of their lives forever. Eventually, Shi Peipu revealed that she had connections to Chinese intelligence. She convinced Boursiquot that to ensure their safety, he needed to pass embassy documents to her. He agreed, and for years, he provided a steady flow of information, all for the promise of protection for the woman he loved. But then, Boursiquot was recalled to France. Before he left, Shi Peipu told him she was pregnant with his child. He promised he would find a way to bring her and their child to France. It took years, but he eventually did. By the time they arrived, their son, Shi Daodo, was 14 years old. But their reunion was short-lived. Problems arose during passport checks when officials noticed inconsistencies with Shi Peipu's identity. Then, in 1983, French authorities arrested Boursiquot in public, accusing him of espionage for China. They also revealed that his partner, Shi Peipu, was not a woman at all, but a man with ties to Chinese intelligence. Boursiquot was devastated and refused to believe it. But during the trial, Shi Peipu himself confirmed that it was all true. He had deceived Boursiquot for almost 20 years as part of an elaborate intelligence operation. It's one of the most stunning examples of how personal relationships can be weaponized for espionage. The story of Larry Wu Tai-chin and Shi Peipu shows the incredible patience and unconventional methods that define Chinese intelligence operations. From manipulating prisoners of war to exploiting personal relationships, these cases reveal a strategy that is as complex as it is effective. They highlight a long-game approach, where loyalty is tested, identities are blurred, and the lines between friend and foe are constantly redrawn. The details of this story are so bizarre they shocked everyone involved. Many later wondered how their relationship even lasted for so many years. According to court testimony, a combination of deception and clever physical concealment made it all possible. Under these circumstances, an unsuspecting partner could easily be misled. As for the child, it was later established that he had been adopted. Overwhelmed by everything that had happened, Bernard Boursiquot attempted to take his own life. He survived and eventually stood trial alongside Shi Peipu. Both were sentenced to 6 years in prison. However, they were released early after expert analysis showed that out of the 150 documents obtained by Chinese intelligence, none were of real strategic importance. Shi Peipu passed away at the age of 70. Before his death, he insisted that his feelings for Boursiquot were genuine. Boursiquot spent his later years in a retirement facility. Their adopted son, Shi Daodo, lives in France today, where he has a family and 3 sons of his own. As this case shows, Chinese intelligence operations can be incredibly inventive and are often prepared for long-term involvement. Some agents dedicate significant portions of their lives to a single operation. The 70s and 80s marked a period when Chinese intelligence services focused heavily on establishing extensive internal oversight. Dissidents, journalists, and especially foreigners were under constant observation. This was relatively easy to achieve back when intelligence structures had such broad authority. For example, in the early 80s, a new agency, the Ministry of State Security, or MSS, emerged. This organization combined multiple functions. To put it in perspective, abroad it acted like a foreign intelligence service, but internally it functioned like a security service. On top of that, it maintained one of the strongest cyber divisions in the world. Much about the MSS remains a mystery. The number of personnel is classified. The locations of its headquarters are undisclosed. There's no official website or press office. The only person with a full picture of its operations is the head of state. The events of June 1989 became a defining moment for China. Mass demonstrations erupted across the country. People demanded reforms related to censorship, the economy, and political conditions. It was evident that tensions were rising daily. Students became the main driving force behind the movement. More than 1 million people gathered, making it the largest protest in the history of Communist China. It might have been possible to resolve the situation differently. However, the authorities chose another path and deployed the military. The most tragic events unfolded in Tiananmen Square. Military forces and security units used force against the crowd. According to various estimates, between 300 and 3,000 people lost their lives. Official government statements, however, claim that no one was killed during those days. To this day, no verifiable evidence has been provided to support this position, and all related data remains classified. Security agencies work tirelessly to ensure that information about the incident does not appear publicly. You will not find open information about the events in Tiananmen Square. And if someone in China discusses it openly, they can face serious difficulties. You likely won't even be able to find it through common search methods online. This is because sophisticated filtering mechanisms limit access to certain queries or keywords. Technically, you might be able to type them, but no results will appear. This level of control is possible because Chinese institutions have been actively operating in cyberspace since 2003. Their main task has been to isolate and guide the information environment. In 2003, the concept of China's peaceful rise was introduced. It promoted the idea that China would grow and strengthen without direct confrontation with the United States. However, the roots of this concept are linked to analytical and strategic circles. Following Deng Xiaoping's famous guidance to hide your strength and bide your time, it becomes clear that real capabilities were deliberately understated. All the while, preparation continued for a time when China would be strong enough to compete with global powers. It was a very thoughtful, long-term plan. Many people around the world believed China wasn't interested in global dominance, but this perception was partly shaped through these coordinated information strategies. As digital technologies expanded in the 2000s, the Ministry of Internal Affairs began working closely with major Chinese corporations that store vast amounts of user data. In today's world, it is extremely difficult to hide information. But state institutions in China operate in close coordination with regulatory bodies, and this extends to the offices of social media platforms. Cyber divisions monitor and restrict any content they consider sensitive. The events at Tiananmen Square remain a restricted topic for users. The Falun Gong spiritual movement is another example. Messaging platforms often prevent such topics from even being shared. Users might find they simply cannot send certain messages or images. Political satire, caricatures, memes, or other content considered unfavorable are also restricted. At times, these limitations can reach an extreme level. It's widely known that comparisons involving Xi Jinping and certain fictional characters have circulated online. As a result, images, videos, or even symbolic references related to this topic are restricted. Violating these rules can lead to serious consequences, and there are many documented cases of this. All of this stems from systematic efforts that began in the late 1990s. In 1998, the Ministry of Public Security launched a project known as the Golden Shield, more famously referred to as the Great Firewall of China. If you've seen Game of Thrones, you might recall the massive wall that protected the kingdom from northern threats. In a similar way, digital barriers were created to limit external information flows. Just as the Great Wall once served as a physical defense, the firewall now functions as an informational barrier. It also limits the influence of external cultural trends. Within this system, thousands of companies operate under strict regulatory oversight. For example, if users display content involving smoking, alcohol, tattoos, prohibited expressions, or symbols, their accounts may be restricted. Repeat violations can lead to permanent bans. During planned protests, digital restrictions can be applied to prevent people from coordinating. Devices may temporarily lose functionality. Communication, photography, and data transfer can all be disabled remotely. Alongside restricting critical content, security services also actively promote favorable narratives. There's a well-known group of pro-government online commentators. They receive small payments for creating supportive content, which can include videos, images, text posts, or comments. This kind of information influence remains one of the key tools used by the authorities. Overall, the decision to build a separate, controlled internet environment has proven to be incredibly effective from the government's perspective. In other countries, shutting down the internet has often led to unrest and political change. China, instead, restricted external access while simultaneously developing its own domestic platforms. As a result, users remain within a controlled information space, making it extremely difficult to organize large-scale actions. This digital control is reinforced by massive physical surveillance systems. By 2018, China had approximately 200 million surveillance cameras equipped with facial recognition technology. Identification became highly efficient. Based on behavior ratings, which are part of the evolving social credit system, individuals may face restrictions on employment, travel, or access to basic services. It's a complex web of control that has been decades in the making. Chinese agencies are active all over the world, but especially in India and the United States. In India, where there's less of a physical diaspora infrastructure, digital monitoring is the primary tool. A huge portion of cyber incidents affecting India actually trace back to China. We're talking about dozens of mobile platforms designed to collect user data. Back in 2010, China even set up multiple centers and companies in Nepal, right near the Indian border, to gather information and expand its influence. These efforts are still ongoing. While territorial disputes continue, large-scale conflict is avoided, mainly due to strategic deterrence on both sides. Now, the situation in the United States is even more complex. Take the high-profile case from July 2010 involving a 74-year-old man named Deng Fangcheng, also known as Graham. He was a former Boeing engineer who, for 30 years, had been cooperating with Chinese intelligence services. He actually became the first person linked to China to be convicted of economic espionage. The case against him dragged on for 4 years. Investigators discovered he had over 225,000 documents related to military and space programs, along with sensitive economic and defense data. The damage to Boeing alone was estimated at around $1 billion. During his trial, he said, "I am not a spy. I am just an ordinary person. I took Boeing documents home to write a book. I love this country. I apologized and asked to peacefully live the rest of my life with my family." This plea was denied. Few believed his story. And Deng Fangcheng was sentenced to nearly 16 years in prison. But Chinese intelligence activity isn't just about economic infiltration. They try to gain access wherever they can. Sometimes, this influence even seeps into educational settings involving Chinese nationals in the U.S. For instance, in the mid-2000s, some schools and colleges started presenting information about the Tiananmen Square events in a much more neutral or softened way. This issue has since been addressed, but the fact that education was affected just shows the incredible scale and reach of these efforts. Their overall approach can seem risky. By relying on non-professional sources, it creates an impression that Beijing is just getting fragmented data, but this is a distraction. Alongside these methods, highly trained operatives are also at work. Posing very real challenges, American analysts believe that Chinese students, tourists, and scientists attending conferences might be pressured or monitored. It's one of the easiest and, most importantly, cheapest ways to gather information. These individuals aren't paid for their cooperation. In many cases, refusing isn't really an option. If they do, they could face difficulties when they return home. Human resources remain a go-to tool for Chinese intelligence. But at the same time, their technological capabilities are rapidly expanding, especially when it comes to data access. A prime example is Huawei. The CIA has stated that the corporation might receive indirect support from Chinese intelligence. This led the United States to urge its allies to limit the use of Huawei products. Because Chinese authorities have regulatory access to their domestic companies, they can potentially access user data as well. And a smartphone is one of the simplest tools for monitoring someone's behavior. Mobile devices were also a huge factor in the outcome of the 2019 Hong Kong protests. This region has always been a sensitive spot for Beijing, as a former British colony. It still has its own distinct legal and cultural system, making it very different from mainland China. It's historically been more open, with freedom of speech and strong Western cultural influences. When the UK transferred Hong Kong to China in 1997, an agreement guaranteed the one country, two systems principle. This was supposed to ensure regional autonomy for at least 50 years. China was always cautious about this, seeing Hong Kong as an alternative model of governance. The protests kicked off in June 2019 after discussions about a no extradition law. The case that sparked it involved a young Hong Kong resident who committed a crime in Taiwan and then returned to Hong Kong, where he couldn't be extradited due to legal loopholes. Authorities saw this as a security issue, as it highlighted Hong Kong's legal separation. The proposed changes to the law triggered massive public opposition. Lawyers and civil rights advocates organized huge demonstrations, arguing that Hong Kong was one of the last places offering legal protection from political pressure. Ultimately, these protests were dispersed, and cyber divisions played a key role. Messaging platforms were restricted, preventing protesters from coordinating, sharing locations, or organizing effectively. The authorities operated on multiple fronts during the unrest. Today, Hong Kong still technically maintains a separate judicial and legal system, which includes rights like freedom of assembly and expression. However, this framework is set to expire in 2047, and what comes next is anyone's guess. Despite the formal freedoms, regulatory bodies now strictly monitor any protest activity, limiting its effectiveness. The demonstrations that started in 2019 still pop up intermittently. Finally, Chinese intelligence activity has also spread deep into Europe. Germany's armed forces, the Bundeswehr, reported that espionage linked to China costs the country between 20 and 50 billion euros every single year, and that's just Germany. These data collection efforts are massive. Chinese agencies actively recruit their citizens living abroad. American counterintelligence has noted similarities to old Soviet-era methods, with a priority on the sheer volume of information. But Chinese structures have surpassed those old models through technology, enabling monitoring far beyond national borders. Avoiding this influence is incredibly difficult. One option being discussed is limiting Chinese technology, but that's a huge challenge, at least for now. And of course, we all know about TikTok. The US has taken steps to restrict its use, similar to what India has done. According to the Associated Press, several states have introduced partial or full restrictions on the platform. These actions are based on concerns that ByteDance, TikTok's parent company, cooperates with Chinese authorities, a claim echoed by U.S. agencies. As a result, digital platforms and devices using Chinese tech are facing more and more scrutiny. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. Please leave a reaction and a comment, and share this video with others, and be sure to subscribe to support the channel. See you next time.